The morning broke over the desert like a tired promise, pale gold spilling across the rocks, dust rising off the trail like smoke from an old wound. Jeb Hollister had been in the saddle since before dawn, rifle across his lap, the chill biting at his fingers through worn gloves. He hadn't eaten anything but a strip of jerky in 2 days, and that was mostly salt and memory. The deer had moved on, or maybe they'd learned to stay still when a man was hungry enough to shoot shadows. He rode with his hat pulled low, eyes scanning the horizon for movement. The land stretched out in every direction, endless as regret, flat scrub, twisted mesquite, the distant shimmer of heat even in morning light. He was deep into Apache country now, though he didn't much think of it that way. To Jeb, all of it was God's land, or nobody's. But every rock and ridge here carried ghosts, and he could feel them watching when the wind shifted. His horse, a rangy sorrel named Dusty, stumbled on a patch of loose stone and snorted. Jeb reined him in, dismounted, and crouched to look at the tracks half buried in the sand. They were fresh, deer, by the shape of it, heading downhill toward the creek. He checked the sun's angle, adjusted the strap of his rifle, and followed on foot. The air grew cooler near the water, heavy with the smell of mesquite and damp earth. He moved slow, careful not to break twigs underfoot. The hunt had its own rhythm, breath, step, silence. It was something he understood better than words. But as he rounded a bend in the creek, the silence broke, not with the flick of a deer's tail or the rustle of brush, but with something heavier. A horse lay sprawled near the water's edge, ribs heaving once, then still. Its flank was dark with blood, arrows jutting from its side. Jeb froze, hand tightening on his rifle. A few feet beyond the dead horse was a shape on the ground, small, still, wrapped in a torn blanket. For a long moment he thought it was another corpse. Then it moved, just barely, a hand twitching weakly against the dirt. He stepped closer, every nerve prickling. The figure was a woman, Apache, by her dress and the copper tone of her skin. Her face was streaked with blood and dust, her long hair tangled across her shoulders. One leg was twisted at a wrong angle, and the rest of her looked like she'd fought a mountain and lost. Jeb lowered his rifle and knelt beside her. Her eyes flickered open, dark, sharp even through the haze of pain. She looked at him with something like defiance, then shut them again, too weak to speak. He sat back on his heels, weighing his choices. Helping her meant trouble. The army patrols didn't take kindly to white men harboring wounded Apaches. But leaving her here, that wasn't something he could stomach either. Hell, he muttered under his breath. You sure picked the wrong man to run into. He took a swallow from his canteen, then gently lifted her head and poured a few drops between her lips. She coughed, swallowed, and whispered something in her language, soft, broken, like the sound of wind through dry grass. He didn't understand, but the tone was enough. She wasn't begging, she was telling him to leave her be. Jeb wasn't the kind to take orders easy. He fetched his bedroll from the saddle, tore it in half, and used the canvas to splint her leg as best he could. Then he dragged the dead horse's saddle off, bundled what little gear it had, and set about figuring how to get her back to his cabin. It was a long ride, 15 miles of bad land and worse weather, and she was dead weight most of the way. He lifted her carefully onto Dusty's back, tied her steady with his rope, then mounted behind, holding her upright with one arm as he nudged the horse into a slow walk. The sun rose high, burned the sky white, then began to slide down again before they reached the foothills. By the time his cabin came into view, a squat line of logs by a stand of pines, he was near spent. His shirt clung to his back, and his throat felt scraped raw from dust. He dismounted, carried her inside, and laid her on his bunk. She was feverish, skin burning under his hand. The arrow wounds weren't fresh, at least a day old. Infection had already started its cruel work. Jeb cleaned what he could, boiled water on the stove, and used whiskey to wash the cuts. She woke once, eyes wide and wild, and tried to shove him away. Easy, he said, voice low. Ain't here to hurt you. She stared at him like she didn't believe it. Then she turned her face to the wall and slipped back into uneasy sleep. Outside, the coyotes started their howling. Jeb sat by the stove, hat in his hands, staring into the fire. He hadn't meant to bring trouble home. He just wanted meat for the week, maybe jerky enough to last till spring. Now he had a wounded stranger under his roof, an Apache woman no less, and the kind of secret that could get a man hanged by his own neighbors. But when he thought about the way she'd looked, bleeding and alone by that creek, he couldn't feel sorry for what he'd done. Reckon you'd do the same for me, he said quietly, though she couldn't hear. The fire popped. The desert wind slipped through the cracks in the walls, carrying sand and whispers of the land outside. Jeb sat there till the embers glowed low, listening to the sound of her breathing, shallow but steady, and thinking how strange the world could turn in the span of a single day. He'd gone out hunting for meat. He'd come back with something he didn't understand, and maybe couldn't ever. The fever came in waves. Sometimes she lay still as stone, breathing shallow, eyes half open and unseeing. Other times she thrashed against the sheets, whispering in her language, words that sounded like prayer or warning. Jeb didn't know which. He sat through most of those nights with his rifle across his knees and the fire crackling low, half afraid she'd die, half afraid she wouldn't. On the third morning, her fever broke. She woke with a start, eyes darting around the cabin as if she'd forgotten where she was. When she saw him, sitting at the table with his coffee, she stiffened, trying to push herself upright. The effort made her wince, and she sank back down, clutching her side. "Take it easy," he said quietly. "You're safe here." She didn't answer. Her gaze went to the door, then to the rifle leaning against the wall. Jeb noticed and slid it farther out of reach. Not a threat, just a message. He wasn't careless, and he wasn't a fool. He poured water into a tin cup and held it out. She hesitated before taking it, drinking slow, eyes never leaving his face. "Name's Jeb Hollister," he said. "Don't expect you care much about that, but it's something." She set the cup down and said one word, "Taji." Her voice was hoarse but steady. He nodded. "Taji. All right then." There wasn't much else to say. Words were thin currency out here. He went about his chores, chopping wood, checking the snares, tending to Dusty, while she watched from the bunk, half hidden under the blanket. He caught her studying him more than once, her expression unreadable. By sundown, he'd boiled a bit of cornmeal and beans for supper. She didn't eat at first, just stared at the bowl like it might be a trick. Then hunger won out. She ate slow, deliberate, her hands trembling slightly. Jeb didn't press her with questions. He figured if she wanted to tell her story, she would. Over the next few days, she grew stronger. He saw her try to stand once, gripping the table for balance. Before her injured leg gave out, she cursed under her breath. He didn't know the words, but he knew the sound of frustration well enough. He helped her back to the bunk. "Ain't no shame in healing," he said. Her eyes flashed at him, a sharp look that said she didn't need pity. The days settled into a rhythm. Jeb hunted and trapped. She mended what she could, cleaned, or simply sat by the window, staring at the far hills as if listening to something he couldn't hear. They spoke little, but something like understanding grew between them, the kind that doesn't need words. Once, while he was mending a bridle strap, she asked, "Why help me?" Her English was halting, shaped by an accent that softened the edges of every word. Jeb thought about that a moment. "Guess I didn't think much on it," he said. "Seemed the right thing to do." She studied him, then looked away. "White men, not help Apache." He sighed. "Most don't, but I ain't most." That earned a faint, skeptical smile, gone as soon as it came. Weeks passed. Winter crept closer. The nights grew colder, and snow began to dust the peaks. Jeb patched the roof, stacked firewood, and tried not to think about what he'd do when she was well enough to leave. One afternoon he returned from checking traps to find her outside, leaning on a crutch he'd carved from a sapling. She was moving slow, testing her strength, her face set in quiet determination. "Reckon you're gettin' restless," he said, setting down his catch. She looked at him, the faintest spark of pride in her eyes. "No, want stay weak." He smiled a little. "Can't argue with that." They worked side by side for a while, him skinning rabbits, her helping as best she could. She moved with a kind of grace, even injured, deliberate, efficient. There was something about the way she handled a knife, the steady hands, that told him she'd done her share of surviving long before he ever showed up. When dusk fell, they sat by the fire. She asked about the world beyond the mountains, the towns, the soldiers, the mines. He told her what he knew, careful to keep it simple. In return, she spoke, haltingly, of her people, the raids, the sickness, the hunger that drove them north. "Many gone," she said softly, staring into the flames. "My brother dead, my horse dead, I not know why I live." Jeb poked at the fire, jaw tight. "Sometimes living ain't got to have a reason. Sometimes it just happens." She nodded slowly, like she was turning the thought over in her mind. That night, A storm rolled in from the west. Rain pounded the roof, wind howled through the pines. The cabin creaked and groaned like an old ship. Taji stirred in her sleep, murmuring something, then sat up suddenly, eyes wide with fear. Jeb was already awake. "You all right?" he asked. She didn't answer at first, breathing hard. Then she said, "Dream. Bad dream." He nodded. "We all get those." After a long silence, she said quietly, "Men came. Kill my people. Take horses. I run." Her voice broke for a moment, then steadied. "They chase. Shoot my horse." He didn't ask who they were. He didn't need to. The territory was full of men with rifles and reasons to hate. "I ain't them," he said softly. "I know." Her tone surprised him, certain, almost gentle. The storm passed, but the memory of that night hung between them like smoke. Something had shifted, a quiet understanding that neither of them said aloud. Over the next days, she began to move more freely. He caught her outside one morning, feeding Dusty with a handful of oats. The horse seemed to like her, ears twitching, nose nudging her palm. Jeb watched from the doorway, smiling faintly. "You keep that up, he's liable to follow you when you leave," he said. She looked back at him, the faintest hint of sadness in her eyes. "Maybe he follow you instead." He frowned, but didn't press. The truth was, the thought of her leaving sat heavy in his chest. He'd grown used to her quiet presence, the sound of her voice, the way she watched the world as if weighing every part of it. The cabin felt less like a tomb with her in it. But he knew better than to think it could last. The frontier didn't allow for sentiment. Sooner or later, someone would come asking questions, soldiers, scouts, maybe worse. And when that happened, everything he'd built would be ash. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Taji stood by the doorway, looking west. "Soon I go," she said. Jeb nodded slowly, not trusting himself to speak. She turned toward him. "You help me live. I not forget." He tipped his hat, eyes fixed on the fire. "Ain't much to it, just what a man ought to do." She smiled, a small, sad thing, then stepped back inside, the firelight painting her face in golden shadow. Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, long and lonely. Jeb listened to it fade into the night, thinking about the trail ahead, hers, his, and how sometimes two lives could cross in the middle of nowhere and change the shape of everything, even if only for a while. 3 days after she said she'd go, the riders came. Jeb heard them before he saw them, the metallic jingle of tack, the rhythmic thud of hooves muffled by pine needles. He was outside splitting logs when the sound drifted down the trail. Dust rose in the distance, and a cold feeling crawled through his gut. Soldiers. He knew that sound too well, the slow, practiced gait of men who rode like they owned the land. He wiped sweat from his brow, leaned the axe against the wall, and stepped to the edge of the clearing. Taji was by the creek, washing a blanket. She looked up at the same moment, caught the change in his face, and froze. "Go inside," he said quietly. She hesitated, then obeyed, limping toward the cabin. By the time the riders appeared, the sun had dropped low, painting everything in golden shadow. There were 4 of them, blue coats, carbines slung across their saddles, faces hard and sunburned. The lead rider, a lieutenant by his stripes, halted in front of Jeb's gate. "Evenin', mister," he said, voice clipped and official. "Name's Lieutenant Kane, 6th Cavalry. You the owner of this place?" Jeb nodded. "That's right." The lieutenant's gaze swept the yard, the smoke rising from the chimney, the tracks in the dirt. "You seen any sign of Indians around here?" "We're tracking a small party. Hit a supply wagon south of here last week. Killed 2 men. Jeb kept his tone even. "Ain't seen anyone but myself." Kane studied him, eyes narrow. "You live alone, most times. Mind if we take a look around?" "Don't see why you'd need to." The lieutenant's hand drifted toward his holster, not a draw, just a reminder. "Orders, friend. We're to check every cabin within 20 miles. Jeb's jaw worked. He knew how these things went. A man said no, and they'd search anyway. A man said yes, and they'd still break something while doing it. He forced a smile. "You boys can have a look. Don't touch my stores, I'm short enough on food as it is." Kane nodded to his men. 2 dismounted and headed for the cabin. Jeb's heart pounded in his chest. Inside, Taji was crouched behind the wood bin, hidden from view but only barely. He'd told her once, if trouble came, not to move, not to make a sound. Now he just prayed she remembered. The soldiers pushed open the door, stomped around, muttering to each other. One of them opened the cupboard, another lifted the blanket on the bunk. Jeb forced himself to stand still, arms crossed, every muscle tight as wire. After what felt like forever, they came back out. "Nothing here, sir," one said. "Just traps, tools, and a heap of wood." Kane nodded, satisfied enough to pretend. "Appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Hollister. You see anything suspicious, you let the post at Fort Lowell know." Jeb tipped his hat. "Will do." The soldiers turned and rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the pines. Jeb stood there a long while, watching the dust settle, before finally letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He went inside. Taji was still in the corner, eyes wide, hands trembling. When he closed the door, she exhaled sharply and pressed a hand to her chest. "They gone," she whispered. "They're gone," he said. "For now." She sank back against the wall, silent. Jeb poured himself a shot of whiskey, then handed her the cup instead. She hesitated, then drank, coughing once. "They'll come back," he said. "They always do." Taji looked at him, face calm but eyes full of something fierce and sad. "Then I go tonight." He shook his head. "You ain't strong enough yet." "I strong enough to die on my feet," she said simply. That cut deeper than he wanted it to. "You don't owe me that," he said. "You don't owe me nothin'." She looked around the small cabin, the rough-hewn walls, the patched roof, the tools by the door. "You help me," she said. "Now I help you. If they find me here, you hang." He looked at her then, really looked. The firelight caught her face, sharp and proud, and for the first time he saw not just the wounded woman he'd saved, but the warrior she'd been before the world broke her down. "Damn it," he muttered. "You think I did all this just to watch you walk into a bullet?" She smiled faintly. "No, you did it because you have heart. Big heart, but heart make man foolish." He didn't argue. There was truth in her words. That night they sat together by the dying fire, neither speaking much. Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of distant drums, or maybe just the groan of trees. Out here, it was hard to tell the difference. Near midnight, Taji rose. She had her blanket, her bow, a small pouch of food he'd packed without her asking. Her leg was still stiff, but she stood tall. "Trail runs west through the canyon," Jeb said quietly. "Keep to the creek till you see the black rock with a split down the middle. After that, head north. You'll find open ground." She nodded. He wanted to say more, something that could hold the weight of what they'd shared, but words felt useless. Out here, words always fell short. When she reached the door, she turned back once. "You good man, Jeb Hollister," she said softly. "Different from others." He swallowed hard. "Reckon that's not always a good thing." For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then she stepped into the darkness and was gone. The door creaked shut behind her. Jeb sat there until dawn, staring at the ashes in the hearth. Every now and then he thought he heard a branch snap or a horse whicker out in the distance, but it might have been his mind playing tricks. When the sun finally broke over the hills, he got up, went outside, and saw nothing but the empty trail winding through the trees. Days passed. He hunted, chopped wood, kept to his chores. Life went on, but quieter somehow. The cabin felt bigger, lonelier. Sometimes at night, he'd catch himself listening for footsteps that never came. One morning, near the end of winter, he found something by the creek, a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. Inside was a carved wooden figure, no bigger than his thumb. An Apache charm, smooth from handling, shaped like a hawk. He turned it over in his palm, thumb tracing the worn edges. She'd come back, if only long enough to leave it there. He stood a while by. The water, the wind cold on his face. Somewhere out there, she was alive, he liked to believe that. Anyway, moving through the wild country that had nearly killed them both. Jeb tucked the little hawk into his pocket and headed back to the cabin. He never spoke of her to anyone. When the soldiers passed through again months later, he told them he'd seen nothing, same as before. They moved on, chasing shadows. Years later, when men asked him why he lived alone, he'd just shrug and say the land suited him. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light turned red across the hills, he'd take that wooden hawk from its place on the mantel, hold it in his weathered hands, and remember the woman he'd found beside a dying horse, the one who taught him that mercy could be braver than any gunfight. He'd gone hunting for meat that winter, hungry and hollow, and come back with something else entirely. Not flesh, not possession, just the memory of a life spared, and the faint, stubborn spark of grace in a world that had nearly forgotten it.